To encourage older workers to stay on and to be productive at the same time is not always an easy task. Companies are learning that to remain competitive, they have to devise creative benefit packages as well as creative working circumstances to attract the more desirable older workers to stay on, or, as they move laterally, to select them as new employees. The so-called older workers are coming to the realization that at age 50, the average man has more than 1/3 of his life ahead of him, and the average woman almost 40%. Retiring at 45 or 50 or even 55 is often no longer an option under those circumstances. And for psychosocial reasons, it often doesn't make sense. These facts are creating dramatic and sudden alterations in society's views of older workers, many of whom are showing little inclination to go out to pasture. As a result, a subtle kind of intergenerational friction is evolving. The evolving younger, older generation is made up largely of so-called baby boomers who vary in age from approximately 45 to 54. Workplace Visions, a publication of the Society for Human Resource Management, predicts that by 2010, a baby boomer exodus from the workforce and fewer people to replace them will result in a tight labor market, where employers will seek to retain older workers rather than retire them. Our experience shows that that is already beginning to happen, especially in some old-line companies with workforces averaging between 45 and 50 years of age. That same publication encourages human resource professionals to plan strategies now to ensure that their workplaces remain fully staffed, and to start accommodating those workers who will need to take care of aging relatives as well as manage their own aging issues. So, what are the aging issues? First of all, as Sharon Moran, a colleague of mine, and I wrote in the summer 1999 issue of the Journal of Workers' Compensation, the so-called downside of older workers is self-evident, but there is also an important upside that should be taken into consideration. Extensive psychosocially oriented research has shown that older workers tend to surpass their younger co-workers in loyalty, dedication, stability, commitment to quality, ability to get along with co-workers, promptness, and dependability. Their experience is often essential to the smooth running of company operations. Many companies, recognizing these advantages, are restructuring their worker pool to give older workers mentoring and leadership responsibilities that could only be handled by younger workers after costly training programs, and in many instances with lesser levels of skill. This new breed of older worker, selected on the basis of qualifications, is turning out to be a blessing to the workforce. The baggage that older workers carry with them, however, cannot be ignored and has to be considered by employers as they prepare for the changing of the guard. Moran and I also pointed out that many of the older workers tend to be overweight and inveterate tobacco and alcohol abusers. Many also lead sedentary lifestyles outside their jobs and are largely ignorant of good dietary habits. Medical evaluations show that a significant proportion of them are hypertensive, diabetic, arthritic, under stress of different kinds, and suffering from varying types of chronic pain disorders. These incidental human and medical issues are known as comorbidities. And what they indicate is that many of those who have them are like lit firecrackers waiting to explode. A hypertensive on blood pressure medication, a diabetic on insulin, an arthritic on anti-inflammatory pills or aspirin, an epileptic on Dilantin, and a depressed worker on Prozac are all potentially productive employees. But they often need monitoring at work, which they themselves have to be encouraged to request. A positive and cooperative relationship between such workers and their employers is necessary for the sake of safety and productivity. Actually, we're finding large numbers of aging baby boomers in relatively good health, enjoying work, and often unknown to their bosses, planning to stay on in the workforce as long as possible. Whatever the reasons for their remaining at work, employer or self-inspired, little or nothing, we are finding, is being done to encourage this huge number of people to stay healthy. And few companies are demonstrating an awareness that a significant portion of those 45 and older have the types of underlying medical problems that, if ignored, may markedly affect their disability status if they get injured or sick, either on or off the job. There is a difference in older workers that influences absenteeism from work. Despite their being found stronger, more enduring, and more flexible than thought years ago, extensive research indicates that they tend to be more vulnerable to stresses and adversity. Research, for example, at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute has shown that older workers are more likely to be suffering from chronic pain, which means that they're also more likely to be taking various types of analgesics and even narcotics while working. While the hesitancy to single out older workers for special attention is understandable, there are distinct differences between the young and old that warrant differences in corporate risk management strategies. So, what can employers do? Older worker productivity can be maintained and even improved by adapting worker training and restructuring jobs and job sites with the older worker in mind. Psychosocially oriented studies of the older worker in the workplace environment and the impact of company culture on older worker disability management point out that these accommodations may well be the keys to the healthy and cost-effective maintenance of the aging workforce. Various studies are showing the value of the older worker in economic terms. This information is particularly important because Watson-Wyatt confidential surveys of human resource managers indicate that they still tend to regard older workers as, quote, complacent, biding time until retirement, set in their ways, and unwilling to learn new methods of doing their jobs, especially when it comes to electronic information systems, unquote. Interrogated personally by us and members of our team, we have found that they are often unwilling to say these same things verbally. I'd like now to talk about some examples of the problem. In the process of consulting with many businesses, we have found reluctance on their part to admit to many of the issues we are addressing. However, when we do audits of their workers' compensation records, we frequently find that older worker issues are already present in their workforces. Also, in numbers of instances, we are finding that events have taken place that are leading employers to recognize that the issue is indeed upon them. For example, in our experience, a gasoline tanker truck ran into two pumps in a gas station at dusk. The driver of the truck was 56 years old, and it was learned that he was suffering from cataracts, a condition frequently associated with aging. Another example, a 63-year-old machine worker who turned out to be a severe diabetic, severely injured his fingers on the job. It wasn't until the bills began coming in for his treatment and his rehabilitation that the company realized that they had an employee who was a lit firecracker, who finally exploded. In another instance, a packing company had a preferred hiring policy of workers who were on Medicare, which, as a government-funded program, provides limited health care coverage for persons 65 years and older. Believing that that would lower their medical costs, they found at the end of the first year of their new system that their medical costs had still skyrocketed above and beyond what Medicare covered, because they erroneously assumed that Medicare coverage would solve their medical care problems. They had failed to take into account the baggage that 65-plus-year-olds bring with them to work and to develop appropriate programming to meet the needs of their older workers. A candy-producing company located in a large urban area had more than a dozen employees in their 70s and 2 in their 80s. Believe it or not, an 83-year-old employee fell while at work one day. She fractured 2 long bones in her legs and ended up with a medical bill exceeding $100,000. That same woman returned to work after 6 months of recovery, needing special job accommodations. You might wonder why she was there in the first place, but as a loyal employee, this company, with no retirement policy, was letting her decide when she was ready to retire. A 48-year-old elementary school teacher had a heart attack at work. No one had taken notice that she was severely overweight and had been absent a day or 2 a week for months. Even her little students knew that she was having chest pains at work and was popping pills in full view of the children. This woman was a single mother, had 2 children in college, as well as an elderly mother with Alzheimer's disease, and she desperately needed the income from her job. She also obviously needed help from the Board of Education Employee Assistance Program, which she was not getting. These are just some of the kinds of problems that are becoming more and more common with the aging of the workforce. And these are problems that must be dealt with by employers in ways that do not violate the privacy to which all employees are entitled. However, employers have an obligation to help and encourage all their workers to stay healthy. In that context, they can introduce wellness programs, encourage regular physical examinations, and have injury and early intervention programs in place for all their workers, knowing that their older workers will be among the prime beneficiaries of such efforts. As the well-known author Peter Peterson said in his 1999 book, Gray Dawn, quote, "The major economies of the world are on a collision course toward a huge, as yet unseen iceberg known as global aging. Increased longevity is a blessing, but it carries with it costs and questions few countries wish to deal with. If," he says, "we begin now, together, the needed reforms can be gradual, compassionate, and effective. If we wait, if we dither and debate, if we talk endlessly about how to turn the wheel but never get to turning it, then the sharp turn will be sudden and destructive, maybe even catastrophic. We know the challenge is real. Unlike so much of what gets written about the future, this iceberg is a certainty. The only open question is whether posterity will thank us for doing what's necessary and doing it in time. Global aging will not adjust to our vision. We," he said, "will have to adjust to it."
Thank you, Dr. Douglas. And let's now continue with our second question and answer session. Our first question comes to us from the University of La Salle in Cancun, Quintana Roo. And the question, please.
Good morning. From the optima of the employers, for what kind of companies is it better to have adults or A generation members according to their features? Can you typify some of these things? For instance, which companies would benefit from an older generation workers?
Really good question. Thank you. And let's try to go, Dr. Douglas.
There's a new term called intellectual capital. The older worker brings with him and her a certain amount of, hopefully, wisdom. Companies that need this wisdom are the place where they can do a job that's needed. I think that's as concisely as I can answer that question.
Susan, some follow-up on that?
Quickly, I would say that the companies one arena in which older workers are extremely valuable would be in companies who serve the older consumer or older client. And I say this about all generations. Understanding your target market is probably easier if you're part of the target market. So I think increasingly all companies will find that they need older workers to help them connect with older clients and consumers.
Very good. Thank you. Let's take a question now from the National University in Lima, Peru. Do we have the question, please?
From the National University of Engineering,
Thank you.
Peru, Lima. We wanted to ask you whether the emphasis of the globalized economy on productivity and competitiveness is not perhaps a bad factor for the A generation worker in general. Doesn't the new globalized economy negatively impact the A generation worker?
Dr. Jacobson?
We can always learn from what's happened in the past. And as was brought out before, a young child listening to his grandfather, we can have an older person with almost each company, and they can bring forth what's happened in the past and add that to what's ever happening.
So globalization and changes does not necessarily become stilted by an aging workforce. Susan?
I think that's true, except that It's also the case that younger generations are growing up part of the fast-paced, competitive economy where change is the norm, whereas older workers grew up under a different paradigm. And I think it is harder in some ways for them to adjust to the new economy. This is not to say they're not incredibly valuable and don't have a lot to contribute, but it is an adjustment that they have to make.
Yeah, we talked in the earlier section about having to manage some of those changes. Let's take our next question from Codatel in Santo Domingo.
Vis-a-vis the aging, do you think that the new generations do you think they can revert the process, and how would you make aware the population about all of the, and what about the experiments in France and Germany and what their experience has been so far? Do you think we can apply that wisdom and that experience?
Not familiar with those experiments, but Dr. Douglas, perhaps you can help us with this one.
One of the problems, of course, all over the world is that older people are generally held in high esteem, especially by their children and their families. And very often the younger people feel that they should be sitting in rocking chairs rather than out in the workforce. We have to break down some of the misconceptions about what old age means around the world and start encouraging societies to recognize that older people not only should be looked upon with respect, but should be allowed to continue to be productive.
Good. Thanks for those insights. We're going to take a question now from the Technical University in Tecamachalco in Puebla, Mexico. The question, please.
Morning to all of you. Our question is the following. When we see what is happening in the developed countries, in Mexico, which is a developing country, the population in general is rather very young. What recommendations do you make in order to make our organizations aware of the importance of take advantage of the experience of the people of the third age, of the adult population?
Let's start with Dr. Douglas on this one.
Just yesterday, at a conference that our company put on in Florida, that question came up from a Mexican gentleman. And what we emphasized was that the experience and the wisdom of the older people should be brought into play in a mentoring capacity in those facilities where younger people are dominating the workforce. The older people should not be put out to pasture prematurely. They have too much to offer. However, they should not be taking jobs away from younger people. And each society, Mexico in particular, has to work out ways to do that are equitably good for all generations.
And that probably represents a respect, as you mentioned, Dr. Jacobson, of that generation. A follow-up comment.
Bring in the older generation for part-time work. They don't have to work full-time. Bring them in 2-3 days a week and let them add their experience to the company.
Okay, very good. Thank you all for those comments. We're going to go to the University of Sonora in Hermosillo in Mexico. And the question, please.
A greeting to all of the ITC staff and presenters, and congratulations to our speakers, because they have just, Susan, Mr. Douglas, and Dr. Jacobson, for all these presentations and your dedication and hard work, not only for the U.S. but for mankind, with your example of dedication. And I would like to make a very brief comment with regard to Generation A. I think Generation A is a generation that has already given us the very best they had to offer in their own time, whenever they were productive. They have already given us all that, but they still have a lot of very important and valuable resources that you have already mentioned that we can all use and capitalize on, not just to exploit them, but for an exchange, a natural exchange. And I think that it is a responsibility of the whole society to be able to share with them in a natural way with this generation. For example, instead of creating retirement programs to say, oh, okay, now you are no longer useful, you have to go home and go to your rocking chair and rest, we should create programs where we can promote this sharing between generations and to adapt them to the new conditions and needs, biological and physical, of all these generations. And this was the little piece of my mind that I wanted to offer you.
Well, thank you for those comments, and that really brings me back to a question that sort of came out of our first segment. Susan, maybe you can talk about the question that came from Panama on the retirement age and sort of how that relates to this comment.
Right. That's right. The question essentially was, should we have different retirement ages? Should we have retirement ages? I think that the answer is we should not have mandatory retirement. We should not force people out of the workplace who still have a lot of valuable things to offer. We should offer incentives, however, to retire at the age that is most suitable for everyone involved. And in the U.S., we also have raised the age at which you may collect government pension benefits, and that's how you do that. And I think the caller is right. They've made a great and valued contribution, and I hope we've all made that point here today, that there is a lot for them to offer, and that we shouldn't push them out. We should let them continue being productive.
Thanks, Susan, for jumping in there. We're going to now take a question from the Centro Universitario de Tijuana, and we look forward to your question, please.
Good morning, del Centro Universitario de Tijuana. A question for Mrs. Mitchell. The trends of the marketplace change so constantly, they present new challenges. From your point of view, what do you think would be the most important quality or feature and value that a student, an undergraduate, should take into account in a developing country? What is the attitude, and what should he or she cultivate?
Very focused question on a young person and what they should get from all of this.
I think that young people need to understand they're part of an aging world, and we've been very youth-oriented. Most societies have been very youth-oriented throughout history, and young people need to understand that this is not an effort to push their needs and interests aside, but simply to expand the range of possible worlds that would need to be addressed. From a marketing point of view, it does mean there will be more focus than there used to be on older adults. At one point, youth was the only market that most people were interested in. But young people will be sharing the spotlight in some measure now.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for your excellent questions. They were tremendous, and we appreciate each of your feedback. But we've run out of time, and we hope that you've enjoyed participating once again in this exciting multilingual and multinational program. We invite you to participate in our 6th video conference of this year's series, which will air on June 1st, entitled The Emerging Global Superhighway: Internet, World Wide Web, Satellites, and Applications. For additional information on the year 2000 video conference series, please consult your participant's manual, where you will find the dates and specific topics for each program. You may also visit our website, intectra.com. On behalf of all of us who collaborate with the International Training Center, I thank you for your enthusiastic participation and interest in today's program. Thanks, and we hope to see you again soon.